The most dangerous book ever written was not a manifesto for revolution. It was not a call to arms. It was not a religious text twisted by fanatics. It was a slim, 26,000-word political memo written by a middle-aged bureaucrat in a farmhouse outside of Florence. A man who had just been tortured, stripped of his career, and exiled from the only city he had ever loved. He wrote it in 4 months. The book is dedicated to the very family that had destroyed him, hoping they would give him back his job. They never did. But the book survived. And in the 5 centuries since it was written, it has been found in the private libraries of Napoleon Bonaparte, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and every American president since Franklin Roosevelt. Cardinal Richelieu, the infamous Cardinal of France, slept with it under his pillow. Catherine de' Medici reportedly kept it on her person at all times. When Benito Mussolini, the Italian fascist dictator, needed a doctoral thesis, he wrote it about this book. It has been called the Handbook of Tyrants, a weapon of mass destruction disguised as literature, and, by its greatest admirers like US Presidents John Adams and James Madison, the most honest book about power ever written. It is called The Prince, and its author, Niccolo Machiavelli, may be the most misunderstood genius in the history of Western civilization, or the greatest teacher of evil the world has ever seen. I read The Prince multiple times, and today I prepared a deep dive into the secrets and details of the book. Today we will uncover the remarkable story of Niccolo Machiavelli that created the man who wrote this book. We will go inside the book itself and confront what it actually says, dissecting the points it makes. You finally will find out why Machiavelli says you should choose fear over love, and why he forbids rulers to use mercenaries. And finally, we will ask the question that haunts every page. Was Machiavelli the monster, or was he the only person in the room brave enough to tell the truth? My name is Ilarian Kolmogorov, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you will never think about power the same way again. To understand Machiavelli, you have to understand the chaos of medieval Italy in which he grew up and survived as a politician. In 476 CE, the Roman Empire collapsed and created a power vacuum. The Byzantine Empire, under the great Emperor Justinian, was briefly able to conquer Italy, but was unable to hold on to the land long enough. For the next couple hundred years, Italy was stuck in an endless tug of war between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, splitting every Italian city into 2 fractions. One supported the Pope, the other supported the Emperor, creating endless vendettas like we see in Romeo and Juliet, where the Montagues and the Capulets are constantly fighting and killing each other for no reason. Despite that, Italian cities soon got their hands onto a lot of trade, and were among the first in Europe to recover from the Dark Ages, seeing the light of the Renaissance. Machiavelli was born in 1469, and this time Italy was divided into many warring city-states. Milan, Venice, Florence, and Naples were the main players here. Machiavelli was born in Florence, a powerful city-state in northern Italy at the center of the Renaissance. This was a time of art, learning, and enormous political instability. Alliances shifted constantly, foreign powers invaded, families rose and fell. One day a ruler was in power, and the next day he was exiled, murdered, or replaced. Not a great political environment. From the very beginning of his career, Machiavelli showed his insane loyalty to his home city. Despite coming from an ancient family and being well educated, Machiavelli was never a full citizen of Florence. However, he still went on to serve the Florentine government. Actually, a great achievement. At only age 29, Machiavelli was appointed as the secretary of So I'm not trying to pronounce this name, so just read it yourselves however you want to. Which put him in charge of the warfare and diplomacy for the whole city. Two most important things for a city's survival at the time if you exclude trade. On this job, Machiavelli observes the Borgia, a family whose history is full of bloodshed and truly Machiavellian politics. In many of his writings, he later expressed some fascination with their ruling methods, along with noting some issues in their rule. He would later describe the Borgia as the model for an effective prince, with some corrections. Machiavelli was a great diplomat, but in 1512 his life took a dramatic turn. The Florentine Republic, under which he served, collapsed. The Medici family, who had ruled Florence before the Republic and had been expelled in disgrace, returned to power with the help of Spanish troops. The Medici, like the Borgia, were known for their ruthless political intrigues just as well as for their commissioning of works of art that are classics now, like, for example, The Birth of Venice by Alessandro Botticelli. Within weeks, the new government purged the old one. Machiavelli was fired. Machiavelli was considered a sympathizer to anti-Medici efforts. The evidence against him was essentially nothing. His name was appeared on one list, but for that time that was enough. Machiavelli was arrested, he was tortured, but confessed to nothing. He was eventually released, but he was released not because of justice. It was rather because a new pope was elected, but not just any pope, it was Leo X, himself a Medici, and in celebration an amnesty was declared for political prisoners, including Machiavelli. Machiavelli was exiled to the farm outside of Florence, where his family had a small property. He was 44 years old. His career was over, he was prohibited from entering government offices, but his legacy had not yet even begun. For his exile, Machiavelli retired to his family home in Sant'Andrea. In December of 1513, Machiavelli wrote a letter to his friend, Francesco Vittori. He describes his daily routine in exile. He rises in the morning, goes to the woods to check on timber cutting, sits with the woodcutters, listens to their arguments, and remembers his old life. In the afternoon, he goes to a roadside tavern where he plays cards with locals. He gets into furious arguments over a few coins. He writes that in these games he screams and shouts to let his frustration out, and that without this outlet he might go mad. But then, in the evening, this whole depressing scene changes. Because he goes home, dresses in formal robes, the robes he would have worn to meet ambassadors and kings, and enters his study. I enter the ancient courts of men of antiquity, he writes metaphorically, talking about the books he reads. There I am received kindly, and I feed on the food that alone is mine, and for which I was born. I speak with them and ask them about the reasons for their actions, and they in their humanity answer me. For 4 hours I feel no boredom, forget all troubles, do not fear poverty, and death does not frighten me. He was reading history, Greek history, Roman history. He read authors like Livy and Plutarch. He was in conversation with the great rulers and thinkers of antiquity, metaphorically, and from those conversations he was figuring out something new about power. It is important to note the role of Rome here. Machiavelli, one can say, had this dream of returning Italy to the state of the Roman Empire, as much of his work was dedicated to figuring out how Italy can actually do that. Part of this can be seen in the context of the Renaissance, because it was happening right at the time and went on to embrace the culture of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Here again we see Machiavelli's patriotism, because exiled out of his home city and in ruin, he still continued to attempt to help his city and his country become powerful, even if not through politics, then through philosophy and history. He finished The Prince in 1513 as a result of his studies. For this part, it can make it more interesting if you imagine yourself as one of the Medici, trying to survive in the political turmoil of the time, reading The Prince. That is how I read the book, and it made it way more enjoyable. But let's go inside The Prince. The Prince is a misleading title, to be honest. If I were translating it, I would call it The Ruler, because that's what it practically means. A prince is just a random ruler. At the surface, The Prince is a guide for rulers. But at a deeper level, it is a study of how power is acquired, maintained, and lost. In the 26 short chapters, The Prince covers in sequence the different types of states a prince might rule, how he acquires them, how he keeps them, how he deals with armies and mercenaries, who Machiavelli endlessly hates on, and most controversially, how he should behave as a ruler, morally or ethically. Machiavelli's central argument is simple but very powerful. A ruler should be judged not by how good he or she is in theory, but by whether he succeeds in keeping the state secure, stable, and prosperous. The first thing to understand is that Machiavelli is not writing a utopia or dystopia. He is writing a manual. Yes, a manual. His concern at every point is the same. What actually works. Not what should work, not what God commands, not what classical virtue, ethics commands, but what works in the real world, in the brutal political environment of the 16th century Italy. Even at the time, Machiavelli went against the norms. Before Machiavelli, there was a whole genre of works by smart people, philosophers, anyone, who gave advice to rulers, and this advice was called mirrors of princes or specula principum in Latin. But these works shared a common idea, that a ruler's most reliable political strategy is cultivating Christian virtue. They, along with Plato's Republic and other texts on political philosophy, started with an ideal. The ideal just ruler, the ideal state, and then tried to describe reality in relation to the ideal. Machiavelli put an end to this, approaching the issue more realistically. Many have imagined republics and principalities which have never been seen or known to exist in reality. He writes, "For how we live is so far removed from how we ought to live that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done will rather bring about his own ruin than his preservation." That is the philosophical core of the entire book. The gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be will kill you if you confuse them. Now, for the details that made the book infamous. First, Machiavelli starts by talking about how power is acquired. The book opens with a question that sounds simple. Where does a principality come from? Machiavelli's answer is very interesting because he distinguishes between states that a prince acquires through his own arms and ability, his own virtue, as he calls it, and we'll return to that term later, and states acquired through fortune, the luck of being in the right place at the right time or having the right allies. His verdict is simple. States won by fortune are fragile. States won through personal ability are durable, because the same qualities that won these states for a ruler will defend these states. He uses Moses, Romulus, and Cyrus as examples of founders who relied on themselves. Then he uses Cesare Borgia as a case study of the opposite. A man of extraordinary ability who was ultimately undone because of the foundation of his power. His foundation of the power was his father, the Pope. He was taken away by fortune, by dying, and Borgia was brilliant, but he couldn't maintain his empire without his father. The lesson is, if you come to power through someone else's strength, you are only ever as secure as they are. By judging from that, isn't it better to take power yourself than inherit it? Well, here the answer is slightly different, because Machiavelli looks at stability. Machiavelli doesn't really worry about kings who inherit their throne. That's easy. You just don't break the old laws, and the people will stay lazy and obedient most of the time. In all governments, a ruler must have a good source of legitimacy. If you're a mid-ruler, but you rule because you inherited the throne, unless you make stupid decisions, people will be okay with you. But there are way more problems with the new ruler, such as the Medici for whom he was writing the book. The dictator who staged a coup, the guy who came in and conquered a new piece of land, they have to come up with a very good reason why it should be them and not some other random guy from the street being in charge. When you take over a new state, you have a natural problem. You have to hurt people to get there, and you have hurt them. You've made enemies of the old guard, and your friends who helped you want rewards that you can't really deliver. This is why Machiavelli says, men must be either caressed or destroyed, because they will avenge themselves for small injuries but cannot go so for great ones. If you must harm someone, harm them completely as a new ruler, because a half measure leaves them alive and resentful and waiting to strike. What happens when you conquer and annex a territory? Territories that speak a different language, that have different customs, lived under different laws. This is not an abstract question. France was trying to govern the Italian city of Milan, Spain was trying to govern the city of Naples, the Holy Roman Empire was trying to govern everything it could get its hands on. Machiavelli says that if the new territory shares your language and culture, the process of assimilation is relatively easy. Remove the old ruling family and change nothing else. The people will accept you. If the territory is foreign, meaning it speaks a different language, has different customs, you have two options. Either live there yourself, because physical presence lets you catch problems early on and respond quickly, or establish colonies of your own people in key locations. This costs not much and effectively neutralizes the most dangerous local interests. What you must never do, he says, is bring in a foreign ally to help you control the territory. If you will strengthen them, and you will strengthen them, you weaken yourself. And eventually you will find that you have merely created one enemy for another. He cites Rome's management of Greece as the gold standard. Divide the local powers, support the weaker ones, never let any single fraction grow strong enough to become a threat, and never allow a foreign power to gain a foothold. Rome understood this. Modern Italian rulers, in Machiavelli's view, did not, and Italy was paying the price. A large portion of the prince, roughly a third, is dedicated to military matters, another important issue Machiavelli constantly dealt with. Being in charge of Florence's citizen militia, Machiavelli actually saw his ideas take action. His central claim is that a prince who relies on mercenary troops is building a rotten foundation. Machiavelli endlessly and very passionately hates on mercenaries. Mercenaries, he says, are known to advance slowly and retreat fast. Why would they fight and die for a prince who is not even their prince? The moment the money runs out or a better offer is made, so do they. He was not speaking abstractly. He watched the Italian city-states, his own Florence included, lose battles, lose territory, lose everything, because they had outsourced their defense to mercenary armies who failed everything on their behalf. In the end, Machiavelli offers that a prince have his own army composed of his own subjects bound to him by identity and obligation. There is something here that goes beyond military strategy. The deeper argument is about the relationship between a ruler and his people. Because a prince who cannot ask his own subjects to fight for him and die for him has already lost something essential. He has become a stranger to his own people. There is actually a known marketing trick. If you ask customers to do a small service like a favor, waiting 5 minutes till you finish your stuff, then they will be more inclined to work with you as they will think they did you a small favor. And Machiavelli argues the same with the citizen militia. If they defend the ruler, they will be more loyal to him as now they spilled their blood for him, which, as Machiavelli brilliantly argues, raises the ruler's legitimacy even more. But should a ruler prioritize the interests of the people or of the nobility? This is the section of a prince that surprises most readers, because Machiavelli, this supposed champion of ruthlessness, turns out to be fairly consistent in advocating for the interests of the ordinary people over those of the nobility. He argues that every state contains two fundamentally opposed parties, classes, whatever you want to call them. First is the nobles, the wealthy, the powerful. They want to oppress and dominate the people. The people, the popolo, want not to be oppressed. These interests cannot be fully reconciled. Thus, a prince must choose which force to rely on. His recommendation, repeatedly and clearly stated, is to rely on the people. The nobles are few, they are well organized and calculating. They will watch for any sign of weakness and move against you the moment it appears. But there are way more people, and they often have more modest demands. They do not want to be crushed, they do not want to be robbed, they want to enjoy a good life. Well, it's easy. Go and meet the low bar, and they will be your greatest protection. You can rely on the popolo. He cites the Roman emperors as his evidence here. The ones who fell, Caligula, Commodus, Nero, were not killed by foreign enemies. They were destroyed because they had made themselves hateful to the people, and their own guards had no reason to defend them. The ones who survived and thrived kept the people reasonably satisfied, however brutal they were to their enemies. But here is a twist. When Machiavelli was being translated, the word popolo was translated as the people. However, the popolo Machiavelli is talking about is the top 4 to 5% of the population. The merchants, the so-called bourgeoisie, the nobles would be the few at the very, very, very top. But the people are just the lesser elite. They are still the elite. So all of those of you who teared up and declared Machiavelli a Democrat, that was in vain for now. However, we see how other people who read Machiavelli, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, interpret his ideas in the exact democratic Republican way. So you can say that he did unintendedly spark the idea in people's minds. Machiavelli devotes an entire chapter to conspiracies. The problem, he says, is not recruiting the first conspirator. It is the second, the third, the 10th, the 12th. Every additional person who knows about the plot is a new vector of risk. They may get cold feet. They may be offered a better deal by the prince. They may simply make a mistake and be caught. History, he observes, is littered with the bodies of failed conspirators. Successful conspiracies are rare, because the logistics of security at the scale are nearly impossible to manage. The prince's defense against conspiracy then is not elaborate security. It is being not hated. Actually, it is rather being neither hated nor despised. A conspirator must believe that killing the prince will be welcomed, or at least tolerated, by the people. If the prince relies on the people and the people enjoy the company of the prince, or even just feel neutral toward him in a positive manner, the conspirator has no popular cover. He kills the prince and immediately becomes the enemy of everyone. No one with rational self-interest will take that risk. This is again the same lesson from a different angle: not to oppress the people. It is not merely a moral recommendation, it is the most effective security system ever devised. We often say that dictators like Joseph Stalin are Machiavellian, but at the same time, we can see how many of these Machiavellian people did not completely follow Machiavelli's advice, making the naming, in my opinion, slightly unfair, as it attributes the qualities of these bloody tyrants back to Machiavelli's teaching, which often does not include such advice. We see this further when Machiavelli talks about cruelty. Yes, Machiavelli accepts cruelty, a necessary thing, considered necessary for that time. Machiavelli says that cruelty can be used well or badly. It is used well when it is applied all at once. Then you must strike decisively, completely, and then you stop. Cruelty applied in doses, slowly and gradually, keeps your subjects in a constant state of fear and uncertainty, which is destructive. Better one decisive and violent act that shows your strength than years of slow attrition. He cites Cesare Borgia as an example. Borgia's reconquest of Romania was brutal, but it brought order. Machiavelli also cites a man named Ramiro de Orco, whom Borgia appointed as a governor of Romania, specifically to apply harsh measures. When the job was done and the people's resentment had reached a peak, Borgia had de Orco publicly executed, cut in two, placed in the town square with a piece of wood and a bloody knife beside him. But why did Borgia do that? Because the people were satisfied. Borgia had distanced himself from the cruelty. Machiavelli does not moralize about this. He says that it was a masterstroke, but he does not advise endless cruelty. Now, from this, we can already see what Machiavelli will say of love versus fear. But let's end with this. The cruelty Machiavelli advises is momentary cruelty. It is more like showing your strength, but not continuous oppression. Machiavelli, even in the example of Borgia, who often went against his court and nobles in his court, still Machiavelli tries to show that oppression is unreasonable. But a show of strength and cruelty for people to know about it, for Machiavelli, is justified. Now, here is the line that everyone knows, even if they have not read the book. Upon this, a question arises, whether it be better to be loved than feared, or feared than loved. It may be answered that one should wish to be both. But because it is difficult to unite them in one person, it is much safer to be feared than loved. But here is what most people forget. Machiavelli immediately follows this with reasoning that is most often cut out of the quote. Here he is talking about his time, when assassinations of rulers were most common. If you are loved, he explains, someone will want to get power and will ignore your virtue when deciding to assassinate you. If you are feared, however, those who will want to get rid of you will not be able to ignore that. Machiavelli writes that a wise prince cannot and should not keep his word when doing so would work against him. And when the reasons he gave his word have disappeared. He says that men are generally so simple and so dominated by present need that a man who deceives will always find men who allow themselves to be deceived. He gives as his model the fox and the lion. The lion cannot defend itself from traps, but the lion is brave and strong. The fox cannot defend itself from wolves. If you want to be a ruler, you must be both. You must be able to identify the traps like a fox and overwhelm enemies like a lion. Purely lion-like rulers have failed. You must know when to be a fox, to deceive, to play both ends, or you must know when to be a lion, when to show your strength and image. It is interesting about how in this context Machiavelli talks about religion. This is perhaps the chapter that most shocked contemporary readers, because Machiavelli does not dispute the existence of God or attack religion doctrinally, but he treats religion as a political instrument. He praises Pope Alexander VI of the Borgia family, one of the most corrupt figures in papal history, because of his skill at using religion as an appearance. Alexander, he writes, never did anything else but deceive men. He never thought about anything else and always found a subject upon which to practice his deception. And yet he was successful, because people judge by appearances, and the prince must cultivate the appearance of religiousness, of virtue, of mercy, of faith, humanity, integrity, and other cool values, while reserving the freedom to act contrary to these virtues when absolutely necessary. He writes, everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. After 24 chapters of advice, Machiavelli reaches the most philosophically honest moment in the book, and in some ways the most sort of humble moment, because he acknowledges that what he has been circling about the entire time is that even the most capable, disciplined, and strategically brilliant prince can be destroyed by fortune, by chance, by circumstances no one could have ever prevented or predicted. He estimates that fortune controls roughly half of our actions and leaves us to govern only the other half. He uses the river metaphor, and it is one of the great passages of Renaissance prose. When fortune is calm, like a river, man can build dikes and embankments against the future floods. However, when fortune rages, she sweeps everything away. The rulers who survive are the ones who built dikes during the calm. This is the note on which the analytical portion of the book ends. It ends with this very, so to say, sober acknowledgement that preparation matters a lot, but it is still not enough. The world is not fully governable. The best you can do is give yourself the best possible chance and then live with the result. Thus, overall, the book is pragmatic to the point where it can be considered immoral by most people. The book was placed on the index of forbidden books by the Catholic Church in 1599. But before we finally condemn Machiavelli, we need to ask a harder question. Machiavelli wrote The Prince in the context of an Italy that was being carved up by powerful foreign powers. In his lifetime, he watched the French invade, he watched the Spanish invade, he watched Italian city-states fall one by one, often because their rulers were too principled, too naive, too committed to an idealized version of statecraft to deal with reality. He watched a man named Savonarola, a fiery Dominican friar who had seized control of Florence through the sheer force of his preaching and moral authority, attempt to build a godly republic. Savonarola was incorruptible. He was a genuinely devout person. He believed God was on his side. But in 1498, he was hanged and burned in the town square of Florence. Machiavelli was 29 years old and watching from the crowd. All armed prophets have conquered, Machiavelli wrote, and all unarmed prophets have perished. Consider what he actually lived through. He watched Cesare Borgia, a very powerful, very brutal, immoral, completely ruthless guy, build an empire in central Italy through sheer effectiveness and force. He watched Borgia's father, Pope Alexander VI, accumulate more power from the papacy than anyone in a generation. Through bribery, deception, murder, and nepotism, they did that. He watched good men fail and bad men succeed, repeatedly in enough different circumstances that he derived a rule. And he asked himself, what is the actual relationship between virtue and success in politics? His answer is that they are very often inversely related. Because the prince, who is good in the conventional Christian sense, merciful, honest, generous, pious, will often fail. Not because goodness is wrong in some cosmic sense, but because the world is full of people who are not good. And the ruler who always behaves as though everyone else shares his values is a ruler who will be exploited, betrayed, and ultimately destroyed. Here is a part of the Prince where Machiavelli discusses generosity, a very Christian and noble virtue on which we see his way of thought. Machiavelli argues that a prince who is genuinely generous will exhaust his treasury, impoverish the state, and end up having to raise taxes. These actions will make the prince hated. A prince who controls spending will have the resources to actually defend his state and benefit his people in the long term. This is not the argument of a man who preaches evil. This is the argument of a man who cares deeply about outcomes for the people that are being ruled by the rulers he advises. There is a word he uses throughout the Prince that is absolutely central to the work, and the word is virtue. It is not the same thing as virtue in the Christian sense. It is closer to excellence, competence, force of will, and the capacity to impose your intention on circumstances. Which brings us to the other key term, fortuna, which is like fortune. The things you cannot control. Machiavelli writes that in what is undeniably the most controversial and stunning passage in the book, to be honest, he writes, "For my part, I consider that it is better to be adventurous than cautious, because fortune is a woman, and if you wish to keep her under, it is necessary to beat and ill-use her, and it is seen that she allows herself to be mastered by the adventurous rather than by those who go to work more coldly. She is therefore always womanlike, and a lover of young men because they are less cautious, more violent, and with more audacity, command her." The metaphor really, in my opinion, sounds horrible to modern ears. But another thing we must remember is that Machiavelli was definitely a man of his time, with all of the terrible notions and metaphors they used. But the underlying argument here is that circumstances do not wait for you to be ready. The leader who seizes the moment, even imperfectly, outperforms the leader who waits for the perfect conditions to never arrive. Machiavelli is ultimately pragmatic and tries to keep his work pragmatic rather than evil. Machiavelli is interesting because here is a secret almost nobody knows about Machiavelli so widely. He is not fundamentally a defender of princes and autocrats. Those who call him a friend of dictators and tyrants might be very wrong. The Prince is just one of the works by Niccolo Machiavelli written during his period of exile. The other work, the magnificent work, is the Discourses on Living. There, written as a commentary on the early history of Rome, Machiavelli argues at length that a republic, a state governed by laws and collective deliberation, is superior to a principality in almost every respect. Republics are more stable. They make better decisions over time because the collective wisdom of many people outperforms the judgment of one, especially across generations. They maintain their freedom better. They are more resilient. Machiavelli was at heart a Republican, not a modern Republican, of course, but a guy who liked republics. He had spent 14 years serving a republic, as Florence was a republic governed by the people until the Medici took over, and he suffered under the authoritarian rule of the Medici. The dedication of the Prince to Lorenzo Medici was the act of a desperate man looking for employment and for an opportunity to ensure the well-being of his people, even if this meant helping out the Medici, not a philosophical endorsement of tyranny. So, why does the prince read the way it does? Because Machiavelli believed that you can have a republic, but for that you need order. And of course, this is an interesting point that is up to discussion, because we see many people, many dictators throughout history, like Hitler, come to power because people think, well, in order to have democracy, we have to fix our issues first and have authoritarian rule. And Machiavelli's logic in The Prince seems to endorse that. This is the diagnosis of Italy in 1513, and this distraught land where there is no democracy because someone has to come in and unite it. In the final chapter of The Prince, Machiavelli calls for a new prince to unite Italy, expel the foreign invaders, and restore Italian dignity, to return the country he loves so much to prosperity and glory it saw in the days of Rome. He writes, quoting Petrarch, "Virtue will take arms against fury, and the battle will be brief, because the ancient valor is not yet dead in Italian hearts." This is not the voice of a cynic. This is the voice of a patriot writing from exile, watching his country being destroyed, hoping someone will save and rise and save it. Even though he was writing this out of patriotism, I think that Machiavelli was too desperate to maybe assess the situation in broader historical contexts, and personally I disagree with him on this point that a strong hand, so to say, has to be there in order for there to be a democracy, as often this exact same strong hand kills any democracy that there is. But whatever we think about Machiavelli, let's talk about the legacy. The Prince was published finally in 1532, and the reaction was immediate and violent. The Catholic Church condemned it, banned it many years later. Protestant leaders condemned it, the Jesuits condemned it as the doctrine of evil, and yet almost every serious political actor in Europe read it, often in secret, often while also publicly condemning it. There is a concept scholars call reason of state, the idea that the state has its own interests and logic, separate from private morality, and that rulers are sometimes obligated to act on behalf of the state in ways that would be immoral for a private individual. This concept, which underlines virtually every functioning government in the world today, maybe sadly, is directly relevant and descended from Machiavelli and the Prince. Hobbes, Spinoza, and many other philosophers admired Machiavelli for his foundational ideas. Rousseau called him a friend of freedom, arguable, but it sounds legit coming from Jean-Jacques Rousseau himself. But there is also the dark side. Napoleon annotated his copy of The Prince extensively. Benito Mussolini, as I mentioned, wrote his doctoral dissertation on it. Countless authoritarian rulers have used it as a playbook, though Machiavelli himself probably would have regarded most of them as cautionary examples rather than success stories. He was very specific. The prince who uses cruelty purely for his own advancement and pleasure without the goal of order and stability is not displaying virtue. He is displaying weakness of character disguised as strength. But the most interesting place to look for Machiavelli's legacy may be not in politics, but actually in business. The language of modern corporate strategy is purely Machiavellian. The idea that you must understand the gap between how competitors actually behave and how they claim to behave, Machiavelli. The idea that a company's culture and values are instruments of strategic positioning as much as genuine beliefs, also discussed by Machiavelli. The idea that the CEO who is decisive and bold in a crisis will outperform the one who waits for consensus, also Machiavelli. The idea that how you appear to your employees, customers, and investors is distinct and manageable as a variable that is separate from what you actually are and act as, also Machiavelli. Well, there are things that Machiavelli got wrong. Let's be honest, he was not the ultimate genius and prophet. He wrote almost nothing about economics, even though his principles can apply to business, which any modern political theorist would consider a critical omission, because how could you imagine a government without talking about economics? His view of human nature, essentially that people are ungrateful and cowardly and naturally evil, inherently evil, is not universally accurate and led him to underestimate the role of a real citizen loyalty and citizens' commitment to governments in stable states, like, for example, the United States. And he was wrong about women. Half of the human population is barely appearing in The Prince, except for the allegorical representation of fortune, which is definitely flawed. The limitations of his time are very clear here, but still, perhaps Machiavelli's purpose in history was to just get these ideas out there for us to interpret it, so we all could gain something from discussing and arguing about them. Machiavelli died in 1527, the year Spanish and imperial troops sacked Rome in one of the most catastrophic events of the Renaissance. The Prince has never gone out of print. It has been translated into every major language on earth. 5 centuries after an exiled bureaucrat wrote it to try to get his job back, it is still read by presidents and generals and CEOs and students like me and anyone who wants to understand the dynamics of power. And here is the question the Prince leaves for each person to answer individually. Actually, 2 questions. Feel free to answer them in the comments. How far should a ruler be willing to go in breaking not only the rules, but the norms of virtue, morality, and ethics for the benefit of his people? And the second question, is evil inherent to politics, or is just the methods of Machiavelli are evil? Because we have to always think about it. Machiavelli was an experienced diplomat, a person who extensively studied history and philosophy. He knew how things worked both theoretically and practically. So was he writing about the truth, the true evil of politics? Or was he just speculating and there can be better methods to go about ruling people?